Chapter 1. A Strange Proposal. Aurelia Prime, the jewel of interstellar commerce, was a place where the rich thrived and the desperate toiled. Its towering skyscrapers stretched into the atmosphere, gleaming with translucent alloys that reflected the city's endless streams of neon light. Within its labyrinthine streets, fortunes were made, alliances forged, and lives forever altered. Among its most elusive residents was Adrian Voss, a human billionaire whose name was whispered in boardrooms across the galaxy. Adrian's penthouse was perched atop the tallest spire in Aurelia Prime, offering a panoramic view of the sprawling metropolis. The walls of his home were made of a cutting-edge material that could switch between transparency and opacity at will, giving him both privacy and a sense of infinite space. Tonight, the walls were transparent, framing the city's vibrant lights as Adrian sat in his favorite chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The soft hum of his home's AI assistant interrupted the silence. "Mr. Voss," the AI announced in its calm, modulated tone, "you have an unscheduled visitor requesting an audience. She insists it is urgent." Adrian frowned. Visitors were rare, and unannounced ones were practically unheard of. He tapped the armrest of his chair, bringing up a holographic display. The screen revealed a slender figure shrouded in a tattered cloak, standing in the building's lobby. Her form suggested she wasn't human. Her elongated limbs and faintly glowing eyes marked her as a Zenyuri, a race known for their grace and empathy. "Name?" Adrian asked. "She identifies herself as Lyra Kavari," the AI replied. "She says she is here on behalf of her children." Adrian's frown deepened. Zenyuri weren't typically found in places like Aurelia Prime's upper levels. They were a struggling species, refugees scattered across the galaxy after their homeworld had been ravaged in a conflict decades earlier. Most Zenyuri barely survived as laborers, entertainers, or beggars. "Send her away," Adrian said curtly, dismissing the display. Before the AI could comply, the woman's voice came through the comm system, soft but filled with desperation. "Mr. Voss, please. I know you have no reason to see me, but I have nowhere else to turn. I am a widow. My children and I need help. Please hear me out." Adrian hesitated. There was something in her tone, a raw vulnerability that stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. Against his better judgment, he sighed and gave the order. "Let her up." Minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and Lyra stepped into the penthouse. Adrian studied her silently, taking in her appearance. Her cloak was threadbare, its edges frayed, and beneath it, her dress was simple and worn. Despite her disheveled state, there was an undeniable dignity about her. Her glowing eyes, a characteristic of her species, shone with a mixture of fear and determination. "Thank you for seeing me," Lyra said, her voice trembling slightly. Adrian gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, clutching the edge of her cloak as if it were a shield. "You said this was about your children," he said, his tone even. "Explain." Lyra took a deep breath, her gaze locking onto his. "I am Lyra Kavari, a Zenyuri widow. My husband was killed during the war, leaving me to care for our 2 children. We came to Aurelia Prime hoping to find work and safety, but this city is no place for those without resources or connections." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And what does any of this have to do with me?" Lyra hesitated, her grip on her cloak tightening. "I have heard of you, Mr. Voss. You are a man of immense wealth and influence. But more than that, I know you are alone. You have no family, no one to share your life with." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" Lyra's voice grew steadier, her desperation giving way to resolve. "I am asking you to take me as your wife. Not out of love, but as an arrangement. In return, I will care for your household, bring warmth to your life, and offer companionship. And I ask that you provide safety and a future for my children." The room fell silent. Adrian stared at her, his mind racing. Of all the outrageous proposals he had ever received, this one was unparalleled. "You want me to marry you," he said slowly, as if testing the absurdity of the words. "A complete stranger. An alien. For what? Charity?" Lyra flinched but held her ground. "Not charity. A partnership. You have the power to change our lives, and I have the will to make your life less empty. I know it is bold, but I had no choice but to ask." Adrian's first instinct was to refuse. He didn't know this woman or her children, and her request bordered on madness. But as he looked into her glowing eyes, he saw something that gave him pause: sincerity. She wasn't here to manipulate or deceive him. She was here because she had no other options. "Show me your children," he said abruptly. Lyra blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me? You said this is about your children. If I'm to entertain this proposal, I need to know who I'm helping." Reluctantly, Lyra reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled out a small holographic device. She activated it, and an image appeared above the table: a boy and a girl, both Zenyuri, with the same glowing eyes as their mother. The boy, slightly older, had a mischievous grin, while the girl clung shyly to his side. Adrian stared at the image for a long moment. He hadn't thought about children in years, not since losing his own unborn child in the accident that had taken his wife. The memory was a wound that had never fully healed, and yet, something about these two children stirred an old, dormant part of him. "You'll stay here tonight," he said finally, his voice firm. "I'll make my decision in the morning." Lyra's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Voss. Truly." As she followed the AI's guidance to a guest room, Adrian remained seated, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in years, he felt the heavy stillness of his life begin to shift. Chapter 2. A Proposal Under Scrutiny. Adrian sat in his expansive living room the next morning, a cup of steaming coffee in hand. The golden light of Aurelia Prime sunrise poured through the translucent walls, bathing the space in warmth. But Adrian felt none of it. His mind raced as he replayed the previous night's encounter with Lyra Kavari. He had spent the night poring over her background. A quick check of the Galactic records had confirmed most of her story. She was indeed a refugee from the Zenyuri conflict. Her late husband had been a resistance fighter who died in the war's final days. She and her two children had been registered at a relief center on Aurelia Prime months ago, but like many refugees, they had slipped through the cracks of the system. Still, Adrian couldn't shake the absurdity of her proposal. He was a man of logic, used to calculated risks and measurable returns. Lyra's offer defied all of that. And yet, there was something about her desperation, her determination, that had stayed his refusal. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps. He looked up to see Lyra entering the room, her movements tentative. She had cleaned herself up, and though her simple dress was still worn, it no longer carried the dust of the streets. Her glowing eyes met his, a flicker of uncertainty in their depths. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice tinged with hesitance. "I hope I'm not intruding." Adrian gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Lyra obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, the two sat in silence, the hum of the city below the only sound between them. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Adrian began, his tone measured. "It's unorthodox, to say the least." Lyra's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers tightening. "I understand. I know how it must seem. What I don't understand," Adrian continued, "is why me? You must know how this will look to others: an alien widow, begging a wealthy human for help. People will assume the worst. That you're using me." Lyra's head snapped up, her glowing eyes fierce. "I'm not using you. I'm fighting for my children, for their future. If that makes me desperate, then so be it." Adrian studied her, noting the fire in her expression. "What makes you think I can give you that future?" "Because you have the power to protect them," Lyra said firmly. "Aurelia Prime is no place for the weak. My children have been bullied, threatened, and ignored because of what we are. But with your name, your influence, no one would dare harm them." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "And what about you? What do you want out of this?" Lyra hesitated, her resolve faltering for the first time. I want to give them a chance, a real chance. And maybe, in time, I can offer you something in return. Companionship, support, a family." Her voice broke on the last word, and Adrian felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. He had lost his own family years ago, and the wound had never fully healed. Was this his chance to rebuild what he had lost, or was he setting himself up for more pain? "I need to meet your children," Adrian said finally. "If I'm going to consider this, I need to see who I'd be taking responsibility for." Lyra's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with cautious hope. Of course. I can bring them here, Dash. No, Adrian interrupted. We'll go to them. I want to see how they live. No pretense. A glimpse of their world. Later that day, Adrian and Lyra boarded his private transport and descended to the lower levels of Aurelia Prime, where the city's opulence gave way to squalor. The streets were narrow and overcrowded, the air heavy with the stench of waste and despair. Neon signs advertising cheap goods and services flickered above crumbling buildings, and the chatter of countless alien languages filled the air. "This is where you live?" Adrian asked, his voice betraying his discomfort. Lyra nodded, her expression neutral. "It's all we can afford." They arrived at a dilapidated apartment complex, its walls scarred by years of neglect. Lyra led him inside, up a series of creaking stairs, and into a small, sparsely furnished room. Two children looked up as they entered, a boy and a girl, both with the same glowing eyes as their mother. The boy, who looked to be about 10, stood protectively in front of his younger sister. His expression was wary, his small hands clenched into fists. The girl, no older than 6, clung to his arm, her wide eyes filled with fear. "It's okay, Taryn," Lyra said gently, crouching to their level. "This is Mr. Voss. He's here to help us." Taryn's gaze shifted to Adrian, his distrust evident. "Why would he help us? Humans don't care about Zenuri." Adrian felt a pang of guilt, but kept his expression neutral. "You're right," he said evenly. "Most humans don't. But your mother thinks I can make a difference. I wanted to see for myself if she's right." Taryn's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The girl, however, took a tentative step forward, her small hand reaching for Lyra's. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" she whispered. Lyra pulled her daughter close, her voice trembling. "We will, sweet one. I promise." Adrian watched the exchange, his chest tightening. He had come here expecting to see desperation, but what he saw instead was resilience. These children had been dealt an impossible hand, but they were still fighting. And Lyra? She was willing to swallow her pride, to risk humiliation, for their sake. "All right," Adrian said finally, his voice firm. "I'll do it." Lyra looked up, hope and disbelief warring on her face. "You mean, I'll marry you," Adrian said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "But this isn't just about you and your children. If we're going to do this, we do it right. You'll move into my home. The children will be educated, trained, and given every opportunity to succeed. And in return, I expect loyalty. No lies. No hidden motives." Taryn stared at him, his eyes narrowing. "And what about love? Do you even care about my mom?" Adrian hesitated, caught off guard by the boy's boldness. "Love isn't part of the equation," he said finally, "but respect is, and I promise to treat her with it." Lyra stood, her glowing eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "You won't regret this." Adrian wasn't so sure, but as he looked at the two children, one defiant, the other clinging to hope, he felt the faint stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Chapter 3. The Struggles of Adjustment. The transition from the crumbling tenements of Aurelia Prime's lower levels to Adrian Voss's sprawling penthouse was as jarring as stepping onto a new planet. Lyra, Taryn, and little Miri had never seen such luxury. Polished floors that reflected their faces, walls that glowed with ambient light, and vast windows that gave them a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline. Miri's wide eyes darted around in wonder, and she clutched her mother's hand tightly. "Mama, is this where we live now?" she whispered. Lyra squeezed her daughter's hand, her own emotions a storm of gratitude, nervousness, and disbelief. "Yes, sweet one," she said softly. "For now, this is home." Adrian stood at the edge of the room, watching the scene unfold. Taryn's reaction was markedly different from his sister's. The boy's expression was one of mistrust, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he stared at Adrian. "How long do you expect this to last?" Taryn asked, his voice sharp for a child his age. Adrian raised an eyebrow but didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to Lyra. "Your son has a strong sense of skepticism." Lyra sighed. "He's had to grow up fast. The war, the loss of his father. It's made him wary." Adrian crouched slightly to meet Taryn's eye level, his tone even. As long as your family lives under my roof, you'll have everything you need. Safety, education, opportunities. But if this is going to work, you need to trust that I'll hold up my end of the deal. Can you do that? Taryn didn't flinch under Adrian's gaze. I'll trust you when you prove you deserve it. Adrian gave a small nod, impressed despite himself. Fair enough. New routines. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustment for everyone involved. Lyra and the children had to learn the rules of living in a world of wealth and order. Adrian's household staff, composed of humanoid droids and a few human assistants, were professional and efficient, but they weren't used to children. The first few days were filled with awkward silences and the occasional mishap, like when Miri accidentally knocked over a priceless sculpture. Adrian was surprisingly patient. When the sculpture fell, he didn't yell or chastise. He simply waved off the concerned staff and crouched beside a tearful Miri. It was just a thing, he said, his voice calm. What matters is you weren't hurt. Miri sniffled and wiped her glowing eyes. I didn't mean to. I know, Adrian said. Just be careful next time. Lyra watched the interaction from across the room, her heart twisting. Adrian's kindness with Miri reminded her of her late husband, who had always been gentle with the children despite the hardships of their lives. It was in these small moments that Lyra began to see a different side of Adrian, the man beneath the wealth and the walls he'd built around himself. Education and challenges. Adrian wasted no time enrolling Taryn and Miri in the best educational programs Aurelia Prime had to offer. While Miri adjusted quickly, her natural curiosity and charm endearing her to her teachers, Taryn struggled. The other students, mostly children of affluent families, looked down on him for being a Zenyuri refugee. Whispers and taunts followed him through the halls, and his temper often got the better of him. One afternoon, Adrian received a call from the school administrator. Taryn had been in a fight. When Taryn returned home, his face bruised but defiant, Adrian met him in the study. Lyra sat nearby, wringing her hands with worry. Do you want to explain what happened? Adrian asked, his tone calm but firm. Taryn glared at the floor. They were calling us names, saying we didn't belong here, that my mom was just using you to get out of the slums. Adrian's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. And you thought fighting them would solve the problem? They had it coming, Taryn muttered. Adrian sighed and leaned forward. Taryn, the world isn't fair. People will judge you for who you are, what you've been through, and the choices your mother made to protect you. But if you fight every time someone says something cruel, you'll lose sight of what really matters, proving them wrong by succeeding. Taryn's defiance faltered slightly, but his expression remained guarded. Easy for you to say. You're rich. No one looks down on you. Adrian's gaze softened. You're right. I've never been where you are. But I've lost people I cared about, and I've faced more than my share of doubt and ridicule. The best revenge isn't a punch, it's proving them wrong. Think about that. For the first time, Taryn looked at Adrian with something other than distrust. It wasn't trust yet, but it was a start. A moment of vulnerability. Later that evening, as the children slept, Adrian found Lyra in the penthouse's lounge, staring out at the city lights. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of the galaxy. He approached quietly, handing her a glass of water. Thank you, she murmured, taking the glass but not meeting his gaze. Adrian leaned against the wall, studying her. How are you holding up? Lyra let out a shaky breath. It's overwhelming. I never thought I'd be in a place like this. And the children, they've been through so much. I worry about Taryn. He's so angry, so hurt. He's a fighter, Adrian said. That can be a strength if it's channeled the right way. Lyra looked at him, her glowing eyes filled with emotion. You've been kind to us more than I expected. But I need to ask, why did you agree to this? Why take in a family of strangers? Adrian hesitated, his gaze drifting to the skyline. Maybe because I saw a little of myself in you. Losing my wife, it left a void I couldn't fill. I threw myself into my work, into building an empire, but it never felt like enough. When you came to me, desperate but determined, I thought maybe helping you could help me too. Lyra was silent for a moment, then said softly, You've already helped more than you know. Adrian met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. In that moment, The arrangement between them didn't feel so transactional. It felt like the beginning of something real. Chapter 4. A family forged in trust. Weeks turned into months, and life in Adrian Voss's penthouse began to settle into a rhythm. Lyra and her children adjusted to the vast differences between their old lives and their new ones, but the shadows of their pasts lingered. While Miri thrived in her new school, forming friendships and absorbing her lessons with the enthusiasm only a child could muster, Taryn remained guarded, struggling to trust Adrian and the life they were building. Adrian, for his part, was discovering a part of himself he thought he'd buried long ago. Lyra's presence had softened the edges of his once rigid world. Her quiet resilience, the way she managed her children with a mixture of patience and firm discipline, and her refusal to let her pride stand in the way of their survival all spoke to a strength he hadn't expected. But the challenges were far from over. Conflict from the outside. Adrian was in the middle of a virtual meeting with his board of directors when a message from his personal assistant interrupted the session. "Mr. Voss, there's a situation involving Ms. Kavari and the children." Adrian immediately ended the call and made his way to the penthouse lounge, where he found Lyra pacing, her hands wringing together in frustration. Taryn sat on the couch, his arms crossed, while Miri clung to her mother's side, her glowing eyes filled with fear. "What happened?" Adrian asked, his tone calm but firm. Lyra stopped pacing and turned to him, her face pale. "A group of reporters ambushed us on our way home from Miri's school. They were shouting questions, awful ones about why I'm here, about you. They scared the children." Adrian's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to Taryn and Miri. He crouched down in front of them, his voice gentle. "Are you both okay?" Miri nodded timidly, but Taryn glared at the floor. "Why did you bring us here if it's just going to make things worse?" he snapped. "They called Mom horrible things. Said she's only here to take your money." Adrian straightened, his face a mask of cold anger. He turned to Lyra. "Did any of them follow you inside?" "No," Lyra said quickly. The building's security team intervened before it could escalate further. Adrian nodded, already calculating his next steps. "I'll take care of this. You and the children don't leave the penthouse until I've handled the media." Facing the scandal. The next morning, Adrian's face dominated the hollow screens across Aurelia Prime. Sitting behind a sleek desk, he addressed the press with the same commanding presence that had built his empire. "I am aware of the speculation surrounding my decision to take in Lyra Kavari and her children," he began, his voice calm but steely. "Let me make one thing clear. I owe no one an explanation. My personal life is exactly that personal. However, for the sake of Ms. Kavari and her family, I will say this. She came to me seeking a partnership built on mutual respect and trust. Her courage and determination impressed me, and I chose to help her and her children because I believe in second chances and the value of family." He paused, letting his words sink in. "To those who spread lies and fuel hatred, know this. My loyalty to Ms. Kavari and her children is unwavering. Any further harassment of them will be met with the full force of my resources. I suggest you think carefully before crossing that line." The broadcast sent shockwaves through the media. Adrian's reputation for ruthlessness had just been publicly aligned with Lyra's protection, and few dared to test his resolve. Breaking down barriers. The public scrutiny eventually faded, but the incident left a mark on Taryn. He became quieter, retreating further into himself. Lyra noticed it too, her maternal instincts telling her that the boy was carrying more than his share of the family's burden. One evening, Adrian found Taryn alone on the penthouse's observation deck, staring out at the city lights. "You know, I used to sit like this," Adrian said, approaching slowly. "When I lost my wife, I'd come out here and tell myself I didn't need anyone, that it was easier to be alone." Taryn glanced at him, his expression wary but curious. "But you don't believe that anymore?" Adrian leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "No. Lyra reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That strength doesn't come from shutting people out, it comes from letting the right people in." Taryn frowned. "But people still hate us. They think we don't belong here." Adrian turned to him, his voice steady. "You belong here because you've earned it. You belong here because your mother fought for you, and because you're stronger than anyone who tries to tear you down." Taryn studied him for a long moment before nodding. I'll try to believe that. It wasn't a declaration of trust, but it was a start. A family formed. Weeks later, Lyra stood in the penthouse garden, a private oasis of alien flora that Adrian had cultivated over the years. She watched as Taryn and Miri played among the glowing plants, their laughter filling the air. For the first time in years, they seemed carefree, unburdened by the weight of survival. Adrian joined her, his hands in his pockets. "They're adjusting," he said, his voice warm. "Thanks to you," Lyra replied. She hesitated, then added, "I never thought I'd see them smile like this again." Adrian turned to her, his gaze searching. "It's not just me. You've done more for them than I ever could. You're the reason they're still standing." Lyra looked up at him, her glowing eyes soft. "And you gave us a chance when no one else would. I'll never forget that." Adrian reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "We're in this together now. A family." Lyra smiled, her heart swelling with hope. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. She had come to Adrian Voss out of desperation, but what they had built together was more than she could have ever imagined. Epilogue: A New Path. Months later, the penthouse was filled with life. Taryn excelled in his studies, earning respect from his peers. Miri continued to thrive, her laughter a constant reminder of the innocence they had managed to preserve. And Lyra found her place as more than just Adrian's partner. She became a trusted confidant, an equal in every sense. Adrian, once a man consumed by loss, rediscovered the joy of connection. Together, they forged a new path, not just as individuals but as a family bound by trust, respect, and the determination to defy the odds. And in the vast, cold galaxy, their home became a beacon of hope not just for themselves, but for what was possible when two lonely souls found strength in one another.